So welcome everybody to the Classical Liberal Seminar. This is our last seminar of the year, and it's my pleasure to introduce today our speaker, Professor Donald Boudreaux. He's a professor of economics at George Mason University and a senior fellow at the Mercatus Center. His academic work spans international trade, antitrust, and the intersection of law and economics. Today, he will speak to us about economic nationalism. Welcome, Don.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here and honored to be the final speaker of your seminar. So most of what I have to say is backed up by a PowerPoint presentation. So I'm going to try to share my screen and pull up my PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully it'll work. So let's see, can you see it?
Yet.
No.
No. Okay. All right. I did something
Not yet.
wrong. Huh?
Not yet.
Not yet. All right. Hang on. Oh, I forgot to hit share. There we go. How about now?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Darn it. Before a few minutes before, hang on, let me try something else here.
I saw them before, so you have to.
So I hit share screen, desktop, and share.
There you go. Now we can see it.
Now you can see.
We
all right.
see the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, got it. So you see the opening slide, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect.
All right. So that's my title, and I want to begin with an honest admission, which this picture is worth 1,000 words or more. That is a picture of the vanity tag on my foreign assembled automobile. In Virginia, we get up to 7 characters and a space, and I've had this vanity tag for a quarter of a century now. So you know my biases. Not surprising, I'm an economist speaking to a classical liberal group, so it's hardly a shock. But I literally drive around announcing my biases on trade. Now, of course, I didn't pop out of my mother's womb being a free trader. I learned economics, and when you combine knowledge of economics with basic liberal values, I think a policy of free trade becomes a natural normative outcome of that. So today I'm going to speak to you mostly as an economist, but obviously the connection between the economics of trade and the philosophy of classical liberalism goes back a long way. Adam Smith is regarded as one of the great early classical liberal moral philosophers. Of course, he was also a great champion of free trade. His defense of free trade formed the core of the Wealth of Nations. And so classical liberalism and the case for free trade are intimately connected. I don't believe that they can be separated. So in the title of my talk today, I allude to James Buchanan's 1963 presidential address to the Southern Economic Association, What Should Economists Do? That was more of a methodological talk. I'm not giving a methodological talk here, but I like the title because I want to say a few words here about what economists should do in the way that we talk about trade. And I'm going to identify near the end of my talk a handful of things that I think even pro-free trade economists tend to do that I believe are mistaken. They are ways of speaking, ways of conceptualizing trade that I believe make the case for free trade weaker than it should be. I will leave it to your judgment to see if you agree with me or not. But I want to begin by sharing some data. I suspect some of you will be more or less familiar with these data, others perhaps not so much. But one of the astonishing things to me, listening to what's going on in the public policy arena now regarding the trade debate, and of course it's front and center, is from my perspective, a complete detachment from empirical reality. The disputes that people have about trade are, well, the beliefs, put it this way, the beliefs that the pro-protectionist forces today, the economic nationalists in the US, are making in favor of protectionism are based on just utterly false factual and historical information. So I want to spend a fair amount of time just making clear what the state of the American economy is. So here are, and all of these are publicly available data. The vast majority of them, as you'll see, come from the St. Louis Fed's Fred website. When they don't, I let you know where these data come from. So one of the most commonly heard claims is that America's industrial capacity has been and is being hollowed out. Since we started these free trade agreements, or since America began running trade deficits in the mid 1970s, we've been hollowed out. We don't make things anymore. Well, this is let me go back. It's an index of industrial capacity. America's industrial capacity today is at an all-time high. It's never been higher. It's 12% larger than it was in December of 2001 when China joined the WTO. It's 65% larger than it was in January of 1994 when NAFTA was implemented. And it's 148% larger than it was in 1975, which was the last year by most conventional measures that America ran a trade surplus. And so industrial capacity being at an all-time high, that fact alone is difficult to square with the incessantly heard gripe or accusation, complaint that America's industrial base has been hollowed out. Now, economists know, and you don't have to be a brilliant economist to understand this, industrial capacity gets built in order to produce industrial output. If there was no capacity to sell industrial output that's produced here, this industrial capacity would not have been built. So let's look at industrial production. This is industrial production. It's an index. So it shows that it hit an all-time high in September of 2018. I think not incidentally, it's fallen a little bit since the first round of Trump's tariffs. But today it's less than 1% below the all-time high it hit less than 7 years ago. It's 18% higher than it was in December of 2001. Again, that's the month that China joined the WTO. 55% higher than it was in January of 1994 when NAFTA started, and 153% higher than in 1975. Now, industrial output is a broader category than manufacturing output. Manufacturing output's included in here, but industrial output includes mining and utilities. So let's look at the somewhat more narrow category of manufacturing output. Manufacturing output in the US hit its all-time high in December of 2007, just as the Great Recession was starting. The Great Recession happened, it fell, it recovered a bit, it's stagnant. Today, manufacturing output is about 5.4% below the all-time high it hit in December of 2007, but it's certainly still quite high by historical standards. It is now 14% higher than it was in December of 2001 when China joined the WTO, 58% higher than when NAFTA began, and 177% higher than in 1975 when we last ran an annual trade surplus. Manufacturing capacity, no surprise there. It hit its all-time high in March of 2008, and it's higher today still than on those past dates by similar magnitudes to how the other measures were higher according to 2001 or with respect to 2001 and 1994 and 1975. So what happens if we disaggregate manufacturing a bit? So very helpfully, some economists at the St. Louis Fed did this back in 2018, and they included in their post, which is still available, an interactive graph that's still live. So it updates every month when new data come in. And this is a picture that I took of that screenshot that I took of that graph just earlier today to put into here. And you can see that the 5 categories that they chose, there are other categories of manufacturing, but they chose primary metals, consumer and electronic products, motor vehicles and parts, furniture and related products, and apparel and leather goods. And this goes back to well before America started running annual trade surplus deficits in 1976. And so you can see the big fall in manufacturing output comes from apparel and leather goods, textiles, clothing. And you can see that did begin, it was more or less constant from the beginning of this data set until the mid 90s, and then it started to fall, and then it plummeted afterward. So someone might reasonably say, and I think there's probably some truth to the claim, that our America's production of textiles and leather goods did begin to fall when NAFTA was implemented, and it fell even further when China joined the WTO. But it's also worth pointing out that uh, every place that I know of that first industrializes textiles and clothing, that's the first industry that emerges. It happened in Great Britain. It happened here in the United States. It happened in the American South when the American South began to industrialize after Reconstruction. And so for a long time, heavy restrictions on textile imports, they only ended in 2006, I think, or 2004. Uh, uh, and then the opening up of trade with Mexico and with China. In effect, what I believe happened, and I think these data are consistent with that, well, certainly these data are consistent with it, I think these data show it, is that America's trade policy for a long time kept alive an industry for which America once had a comparative advantage many, many years ago, but had since lost the comparative advantage, and that industry was maintained only because of trade restrictions. And then as soon as those trade restrictions were eased, that lack of a comparative advantage at this entry-level industry, textiles and apparel and leather goods, was shown to go away. So that manufacturing decline. But look at the other elements of manufacturing that these Fed economists point out. Primary metals production hasn't changed very much. It's about 10% lower today than it was when China joined the WTO. Furniture production rose a bit after 1975, but it's lower today. But the real gains are in the other two, in motor vehicles and parts. The current administration's apparently very much worried about the U.S. auto industry. Well, the amount of these outputs that Americans manufacture hit an all-time high in July of '03. Excuse me, not '03, 2023. So only 23 months ago, and is today very near that mark. It's just a percentage or two below that mark. It's 30% higher. This is now automobiles and auto parts, 30% higher than it was when China joined the WTO. It's 68% higher than when NAFTA began, and 182% higher than it was when America last ran a trade surplus in 1975. Uh, More impressive, much more impressive, is the growth in U.S. production of computers and electronic products. We Americans produce today 298% more of these products than we did in 2001, 2,100% more than when NAFTA took effect, and 23,000% more than when America last ran a trade surplus. Now, these are allegedly products that are they're high tech, they're supposedly especially important for national defense and strategic reasons. Our manufacturing output of those products has certainly gone up. But what about manufacturing employment? It's no secret that a lot of people who believe that America is deindustrializing uh, draw that conclusion from looking at manufacturing employment. I don't have a graph here, but an absolute number of Americans working in jobs classified as manufacturing uh, was in June of 1979. This graph shows a more relevant piece of data. This is the share of manufacturing employment, or manufacturing employment as a share of total non-farm employment, going back from 1939 to the present. As you can see, it hit a peak, not surprisingly, during World War II, and it fell dramatically at the end of that war, went back up a little bit, and during the Korean War, it was basically flat for the decade after the end of World War II until the end of the Korean War. And around 1954, it began a steady decline. And just eyeing those data up, you can see it's a pretty steady decline. Some years it gets a little bit more quick, some years it slows down a little bit. In 1975, it was about 22%. About 22% of American workers worked in manufacturing. Today, it's just under 8%. May of 2025, it's just under 8%. It's been falling. It's falling for the same reason, unquestionably, that agricultural employment fell a century or more earlier. You had a lot of people working on farms in the late 18th throughout the 19th century. And then we had mechanization, we had chemical fertilizers, we had better packaging, refrigeration. All of these things made agricultural productivity rise dramatically. And that meant we can get more output on farms and ranches using many, many fewer workers. And that's exactly what's happening in manufacturing. This is nothing to lament, of course, it's something to applaud and to celebrate. But nevertheless, a lot of people do look at this and they argue that, well, this means it's this decline in manufacturing employment as a share of the total that seems to indicate to a lot of people that America is deindustrializing. But as I showed a moment ago, manufacturing output is near an all-time high, industrial output's near an all-time high, capacity is either at or near an all-time high. And so clearly it isn't the case. The standard story is that, okay, well, when we began trading more freely with foreign countries, all of our manufacturing and industry left. And that's what caused the job decline. Clearly not. The output of manufacturing is today higher than in any of those key dates in the past. What's lower is the share of workers in manufacturing jobs. And of course, that's, again, a thing to celebrate. It means we're more productive. This is a graph that was compiled by University of Michigan at Flint economist Mark Perry. He's a former research assistant of mine at George Mason from back in the 1980s. And Mark has an affiliation with the American Enterprise Institute. And this goes back to 1947. And this is interesting here. We'll talk about this later. So as you can see, the productivity of manufacturing workers rose pretty impressively from the late 1940s until just about the Great Recession. And then it's been flat. It's not much lower, but it's just flattened out over the past 10 or 15 years. But nevertheless, it's still a great deal higher, a few 100% higher than it was during America's alleged golden era of manufacturing in the 40s and 50s through the 60s. And so manufacturing worker productivity is higher. This is a graph from a 2024 paper by Scott Winship, who's now with the American Enterprise Institute. And this shows, as you can read, that real hourly compensation of workers in the non-financial corporate sector, 1948 to 2022, productivity's gone way up and pay has kept pace with it. And so this is, again, a piece of data that belie the claim that as America's trade with foreign countries became more open, ordinary American workers and American productivity, the American economy, all sort of sank into the doldrums and stagnated or either went south. This is a piece of data that's hard to square with that. I apologize for the quality of this. This is a picture from a book taken with my cell phone. Talk about worker productivity. We can take pictures with our cell phones now and share them across the continent in a way that I'm doing now. This is from Michael Strain's little 2020 book on the fate of the American worker. And this is the average hourly compensation of production and non-supervisory workers. This is looking at, as I tell my students, is ordinary workers. This doesn't include hedge fund managers, doesn't include neurosurgeons, doesn't include college professors. It's ordinary workers, the workers that presumably most people genuinely worry about being whose jobs are affected by trade. And a case can be made that those wages stagnated from the early 1970s through about 1990. But over the past 35 or so years, they've not stagnated. They have risen. These data go up through 2018, and they have risen since. But this is such a nice graph, I wanted to share it with you. And so here we have yet more data that are difficult, if not impossible, virtually impossible, I think, to square with the claim that America's greater exposure to the global economy is putting pressure on ordinary workers. And so they have to accept lower wages in order to even keep their jobs. I don't have a graph here about the unemployment rate, but I'm sure you all know that the unemployment rate, since we finally recovered from the Great Recession in the 20-teens, the unemployment rate has been pretty darn low if we get rid of the COVID years. And that's obviously had nothing to do with international trade. So few other pieces of data is real GDP so adjusted for inflation, it's at an all-time high. But just looking at real GDP, you say, well, okay, that includes Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. What about ordinary workers? So I'll get to that in just a moment, but I want to loop back to or anticipate something I'm going to say in a moment about trade deficits. This is a pet subject of mine. You'll get an earful of that in just a moment. But we have, as I said, been running annual trade deficits in the US by most measures since 1976. I graduated from high school in 1976. I turned 65 in 2023. So my entire working life is a period where we ran annual trade deficits without exception. If it's the case that trade deficits strip wealth from a country, if trade deficits are evidence that the country is losing wealth to foreigners, if that trade deficits somehow harm the economy, then it's quite difficult to explain how, during the course of my lifetime, Americans have grown wealthier than during that time, given that we ran trade deficits that entire time. So I wanted to get a measure of the net worth of the average American household, because what people will say about the trade deficit is that trade deficits occur when Americans go further into debt to foreigners or sell off assets. As you'll see in a moment, I think that's a mistake. I think that's just wrong. It can happen, but I don't think it's the same thing as running a trade deficit. And if it were true that trade deficits necessarily mean that Americans are going further into debt to foreigners and or are selling off assets to foreigners, then it must be that the real average net worth of the American household is declining. There's data, the Fed has data on the average household net worth going back to the mid 80s, but I want to go back further. So I found, but I couldn't find anything other than, this is from another Fed publication, balance sheet of households and nonprofit organizations, 1952 to 2024. Why nonprofits are lumped in with households, I don't know, but there they are. So I want to get rid of nonprofits. So I want to start my analysis in the mid 1970s when we began running trade deficits in 1976. And so I found somewhere some documentation that shows that the average net worth of nonprofits back in the mid 1970s was about 1.7% of the average net worth of households. So I'm going to assume that proportion has stayed the same throughout the years. I don't know that it has, but it's not a bad assumption. So I'm going to get rid of the net worth of nonprofit organizations so that I can look only at the net worth of households. And I'm going to basically take these numbers and reduce them by 1.7%. I'm going to adjust them for inflation using the GDP deflator. And then I'm going to divide the numbers that I get for each year by the number of households in the US during that year. And here's what I discovered when I did that. The latest data we have are from the last quarter of 2024. And so the average US household's real net worth was in the last quarter of 2024, 78% higher than in 2001 when China joined the WTO. 140% higher than it was in 1994, the year that NAFTA was launched, and 232% higher than it was in 1975, the year that America last ran an annual trade surplus. I don't see how it's possible to square these figures with the claim that trade deficits represent a net extraction of wealth from the domestic economy. Again, you can tell a story where trade deficits do represent a net extraction from the domestic economy, but it's a mistake, I believe, although a common one, it's a mistake to insist that trade deficits necessarily are representative or a mechanism by which net wealth is leaving the country. Now, some might say when I put this on my blog a few months ago, someone said, "Well, this is only about the average household. Again, it includes the Bezoses and the Musks and the Trumps. What about the median household?" I found it devilishly difficult to find data on the net worth of the median American household. Perhaps it's out there, but I looked and I could not find it. And I don't claim to be the greatest data sleuth around, but I spent some time looking. But what I did find is actually what I did find, I don't have a slide for it. I did find data on uh, the uh, the bottom 50% of households uh, and their net worth compared to the net worth of the top 50% of households. And what I discovered, I'm going to read it here from some notes that I made. What I discovered when you adjust for inflation, that in the fourth quarter of 2024, the real net worth of the average household in the bottom 50% of the income distribution was 84% higher than it was in the third quarter of 1989. That's the earliest year I could find any reliable data for that particular calculation. Not as far back as 1975, but it does look like if you even just look at the real net worth of the average bottom household, bottom half household, it too has risen significantly in the past 46 years. Now let's do it. You all know you've heard of this paper. It was unfortunate that it came out in 2016. That was of course, the year that Hillary Clinton was Democratic candidate and Donald Trump was Republican candidate. And I remember both campaigns trumpeting the number in this paper. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, of course, disagreed about almost everything. They both, however, agreed that America's increased trade with China was bad news for Americans. And this was the famous paper. It's still much talked about. There are various variations on this paper, but this is the one that I think people refer to mostly. This is a 2016 version. And so let's do a quiz about the China shock. Just to refresh, for those of you who don't know, or to refresh the memory of those of you who do, in this paper, Autor, Dorn, and Hansen did not look at the entire American economy. They identified those commuting zones, what they call commuting zones in the U.S., that they had reason to believe were especially subject to Chinese import competition. And they looked at employment in those commuting zones. They didn't look at what happened to employment outside of those commuting zones. And they wanted to get an estimate of the number of jobs affected within those commuting zones by increased U.S. trade with China. The dates they use were from the beginning of 1999 through 2011. That's 156 months, 13 years. And as all sophisticated econometric studies do, of course, they come up with a variety of estimates, like a bottom line estimate, a median estimate, a top line estimate. So here's the quiz.
Can I ask
Yeah.
a question before you quiz us?
Yeah.
It's been a few years since I read that paper. Can you remind us what a commuting zone is? Roughly?
Okay, it is uh, uh, they're defined by zip codes,
Okay.
if I recall.
Okay.
And I forget now, David, the exact method that the authors used to identify which commuting zone was and which commuting zones weren't subject to trade import competition from China. But they're not just zip codes. They are I think aggregates of zip code areas
Got it. Okay, that's good enough.
that
Yeah.
are subjected to trade. They call them commuting zones. So the point is that they are tiny, they are regions spread out. And they have a map in the paper of the commuting zones that they use.
Okay.
And it's not Manhattan, it's not Boston, it's not Palo Alto. Um, um, anyway, so here's the quiz. So and I guess most of you know the answer to this one. So what's the top line estimate of the number of jobs that supposedly were destroyed from the China shock for that entire 13-year period? By the way, they chose 1999. China got most favored nation trading status in 2000, and uh, so they wanted to capture that entry of China. And the answer is 2.4 million jobs. And this is the number that Trump and Clinton both in 2016 were trumpeting. 2.4 million jobs destroyed by trade with China. It seems like a big number. And I tell my students all the time, if there is one economics question to always ask is as compared to what? As compared to what? It's not just an economics question. It's a good question to ask in whatever field you're in. But as compared to what? So here's another quiz to give us a sense of comparison. And so I went to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and you can find monthly data on discharges and separations. These are people who lose their jobs not because they quit, not because they retire, not because they go back to school. A tiny, tiny handful of these people lose jobs because they engage in embezzlement or theft. That's a really small number. Most of these jobs are lost because the firms are downsizing, labor-saving technology has been introduced. So what's the average number of jobs lost each month from 2010 through 2019? This is after the Great Recession, by the way. The Great Recession ends in June of 09. Through 2019, what's the average number of jobs that were destroyed every month in the US? Not just by trade, just by whatever forces. The answer is 1.7 million. So in non-recessionary times in the US today, every 42 days, there's a destruction of the same number of jobs that the China shock took 13 years to destroy. The China shock number is a rounding error. It's minuscule compared to the total amount of job churn we have in the economy. Jobs are destroyed by all sorts of things. This is one of my favorite examples. You all know who this guy is. Along with Albert Sabin, he develops one of the most people believe is one of the most successful vaccines uh, uh, ever. It's inexpensive, it's highly effective, it lasts a lifetime, it doesn't have any side effects. Think of all the jobs that it destroyed. People making wheelchairs, leg braces, iron lung machines, crutches. All those people lost jobs because of this guy. Um, Somewhat more prosaic example. I don't know if you remember this. I suspect some of you are old enough to remember. This is a bumper sticker that was quite popular in the mid to late 1980s. Buy a foreign car, put 10 Americans out of work. The math is all screwy. Don't forget about the number. But the message, of course, is pretty clear. You're supposed to feel guilty if you, in your vehicle choices, you choose to put 10 Americans out of work. You should buy an American-made car. And I remember this bumper sticker, and I just pulled that picture off of Google. But I have a very clear memory of something that happened in 1989. I know it was 1989 because I was getting ready to uh, pack up from where I lived in Virginia, Fairfax, Virginia, and moved to Charlottesville. I went to started law school in 1989, and I was driving on the Beltway in Virginia, and I saw a car that looked just like that. That caught my eye because it's not the same one, but that's almost exactly the kind of car that my parents had when I was growing up. It's a 1963 Buick Skylark. The only difference between this one and the one that I had as a boy, my parents had when I was a boy, is the interior was red. And so, it caught my eye. Well, I hadn't seen one of those in a long time. This is 1989. I'm driving on the Washington Beltway and I see a Buick Skylark. And it catches my eye. And I noticed it had that bumper sticker on it. And a naive person might say, well, there's nothing ironic about that. I mean, a Buick is an American-made automobile. But then think about it. This is 1989. I saw this car. And so this person's driving around with that bumper sticker. How many Americans did that person employ by driving that old car? Maybe we should have a bumper sticker that says, drive an old car, put 10 Americans out of work. Or I didn't stop to interview the person, but it's quite likely that the person didn't buy the car in 1963 or 64, but instead bought it off a used car lot. So we can change the bumper sticker to read, buy a used car, put 10 Americans out of work. The point of this is not to be cute. The point of this is to note that any decision we make, any economic decision we make, I don't even have to qualify it with almost, has employment effects, positive and negative. Any change you make, it's going to create some jobs here, it's going to destroy some jobs here. There is nothing unique about trade, international trade, at creating or destroying jobs. There simply isn't. And so trying to measure the number of jobs that were destroyed by trade with China, I think it's futile. And it may have academic interest, but it certainly feeds, unnecessarily feeds unwarranted protectionist sentiment. So let me get now to some, I'm jumping ahead. Let me get down to, I'm going to keep this picture up for a moment because I like looking at this old car that brings back fond memories. I learned to drive in that car. One habit that economists have that I wish we would stop, and that is saying something like, of course, trade has losers. Now, I'm going to sound radical here. I understand, and I very well may turn some of you off. Very well, in what I'm about to say will cause some of you to think, well, that's just going too far. The case for free trade is strong. Let's not overdo it. Let's not be unrealistic. And the claim I want to make is that trade has no losers. Or put somewhat differently, there's nothing unique about trade at causing what are called losers. The person who bought that car off of a used car lot failed to employ workers in a new car factory. Do we say that choosing to buy used cars or choosing to maintain your cars in order that they run longer, that has losers? By saying trade has losers, it sounds reasonable, and of course we do want to. Everyone wants to attract an audience, not turn that audience off with ridiculous sounding or extreme sounding claims. But I'm sticking to my guns. I don't think this is too extreme. I think it's true. By saying that trade has losers, suggests that there's something unique about international trade at causing job losses. And there is simply nothing at all unique about international trade at causing job losses. So it would be okay to say economic growth has losers, economic change has losers. By singling out trade, we create a suspicion of trade that is simply unjustified. And in a country as large as the United States, not only is trade not the only economic activity that destroys some jobs and creates other jobs, it's actually a fairly small part of those activities that create jobs and destroy jobs. So I don't think that trade, properly speaking, has losers if we mean by that trade does something different than purely domestic economic activity. It just doesn't. Losing a job to trade is a cost. Losing a job to economic change is a cost of participating in the market economy. One of the rules of a market economy is that, and this is one of the things that makes it grow, it's essential to that growth, is that producers please consumers. They try to please consumers. Consumers don't have to try to please producers. And so when consumers change their minds for whatever reason, a new product comes along, consumers' tastes change, new sources of supply, consumers get to spend their money in ways that will destroy jobs somewhere and create jobs elsewhere. And that's just part of the rules of being in a market economy. And trade that happens to cross political borders, there's nothing unique about the change that occurs in when those borders are crossed. And let me just say one final thing about trade and losers. There's also a time dimension. To say, even if you don't buy my claim that, even if you think there is something unique about trade having losers, that we wouldn't say that, well, when more women enter the workforce, that has losers, or when a new startup firm in Silicon Valley begins. That creates losers. Think of a time dimension. It very well may be that if you look only at today or this week, you can look at a handful of people who lose jobs because of greater import penetration. And you can say, okay, well, those people are losers to trade. But what's so special about now? Expand the time horizon. I think it's probably impossible. I mean, I can probably get rid of the word probably. It's probably impossible to find anyone in the United States today, even someone who lost a job unambiguously lost a job last week to imports, whose life is not vastly enriched or has been vastly enriched by trade. So if we take an appropriately long time perspective, you have jobs being created and destroyed. Trade is part of that process. The material prosperity of everyone grows higher and higher. And so over time, every one of us is a huge net beneficiary of trade. Now I want to turn to a somewhat more technical point, but it is, as David Henderson knows, it is a pet peeve of mine, and that's trade deficits. I wish that the concept had never been developed. I don't believe that there is a concept in all of economics that is as responsible for more, maybe not even as much, policy mischief as is the trade deficit. It is not understood by the general public. It's not understood certainly by politicians. It's very easy to demagogue. But here is an indisputable accounting identity. Right? So it is true that trade balance is not just equal to, it is defined as being the difference between domestic savings and domestic investment. And if domestic investment, the amount of investment that occurs within the home country, is greater than the amount of savings that occurs within the country, you have a trade deficit. That is unquestionably an accounting identity. What I want to complain about is the common, and this is done even by pro-free market, pro-trade economists. They'll say, well, the trade deficit, so domestic investments greater than domestic savings, that's just caused because we Americans we don't save enough. If we'd save more, then we can get rid of the trade deficit. And I understand the convenience of saying that because if you accept that, it is true that the blame is put on us. And so when someone says, look, the trade deficit, it's just caused by inadequate home country savings. We Americans aren't saving enough. Then it's very easy to convince someone that import restrictions are probably not going to do much to affect the trade balance. And the fault is ours. It's not foreigners. The trade deficit is not caused by foreigners trading unfairly with us, dumping goods in our economy, subsidizing their exports, having high tariffs against our exports. It's caused by just us. We just don't save enough. A trade deficit could be caused by failure of Americans to save enough, but I don't think that's the case. In this typical way of saying it, domestic investment is treated as an exogenous variable. It's just taken as a given. And so if it's taken as a given, if it's just handed down from on high, we don't bother to look at where it comes from, then, well, let's see, we Americans, if domestic investment is greater than domestic savings, then it must be that we Americans aren't saving enough to satisfy all those investments. And so it's therefore said, so we have to borrow money from foreigners to make up the difference. We have to attract money from foreigners to make up the difference. Money has to be attracted from abroad in order to finance the trade deficit. I think this is very misleading and very, very wrong. Put somewhat differently, I think it's a mistake to say that the trade deficit is a macroeconomic phenomenon. Economists say that all the time. It's a problem of savings and investment. I think it's a microeconomic phenomenon. It's a microeconomic phenomenon because the trade deficit, in my view, is for America, is overwhelmingly the result of the great attractiveness of the American economy to global investors. It's a microeconomic phenomenon. The American economy is large, it's dynamic, it's mostly free, property rights are reasonably secure, the courts are reasonably uncorrupt. We have very good infrastructure. Americans, by and large, accept creative destruction, despite some of the things I was saying earlier. Our financial markets are incredibly sophisticated and deep. It's just a hell of an attractive place to invest, at least compared to most other countries. And the US dollar, for all of the Fed's problems, the US dollar is relatively stable compared to most global currencies. It's accepted globally. So the US economy is a hell of an attractive place to invest. And it's made attractive largely by our microeconomic institutions. And so the attractiveness of the American economy as a place to invest sparks foreign investors, foreign entrepreneurs to have ideas. I want to build a furniture store in Newark, New Jersey. And so some Dutch company, IKEA is Dutch, it's not Swedish, as you probably know anymore. Some Dutch company says, it'd be great. We can make a lot of money building a big, gigantic furniture store in Newark, New Jersey. Let's do that. They need dollars to do that. When they do that, that increases the US trade deficit. That wasn't an exogenous investment event that just happened to happen. It was foreigners choosing to bring more capital to the United States because of the investment promise. And that did cause the US trade deficit to be higher than it would otherwise have been. But it isn't the case that if Americans had only saved more, that furniture store in Newark, New Jersey would have still been built, but instead built by Americans. The amount of capital in the world and in any country isn't fixed. It changes, it can grow, it can shrink. Fortunately, it has been growing mostly during the 20th and 21st century. And so the more attractive our economy is, the greater is the willingness of global investors to do greenfield investment, foreign direct investment, portfolio investment. All of that adds to America's capital stock. There's nothing exogenous about it. So I'll end this little spiel by saying, so therefore, I think it's a mistake to say if Americans were to save more, then our trade deficit would shrink. Maybe, but I can tell, I think, an equally good story saying that if Americans saved more, our trade deficit might actually go up. If we save more, we put more capital in place in America. That might make it more attractive for foreigners to bring yet more capital to the United States. To the extent that greater American savings would further strengthen the American economy, make it more dynamic, it would make it more attractive to foreigners. I can well imagine an increase in American savings causing a higher run of real American trade deficits, not a falling of those trade deficits. I've already spoken for almost an hour. I mentioned at the beginning that I had some research ideas. I'll just quickly mention what they are. If there are any graduate students out there who are looking for a project, as you remember from the data, I won't go back to it. I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. But as you remember from the data, that there was a flattening out of the growth in manufacturing worker productivity starting at just around the Great Recession. And what's responsible for that? There's also, going back to about 2000, there's been the growth in America's industrial capacity greatly slowed. What's responsible for that? Is it a definitional thing? What caused it? It didn't shrink. It still continued to grow, this capacity did, but it slowed. And I wonder why. And let me end by finally throwing out one very provocative, perhaps provocative research project. As you know, Angus Deaton and Ann Case, his wife Ann Case, they famously documented the deaths of despair, and much of that is blamed on trade. Trade happened and hollowed out America's heartland, and these poor people had, they had unemployed, and so they committed suicide. They overdosed on drugs, and that's a very evocative story if you want an excuse to institute protectionist policies. So let's just grant, and I haven't looked at the data in any kind of detail, let's just take it for granted that there's nothing wrong at all with the data that Case and Deaton have assembled, that there have indeed been an increase in the deaths of despair, and indeed an increase in regions that were uniquely or unusually disproportionately affected by trade. How much of that might be explained by Americans being a lot richer today than we were in the past? If it's the case that Americans tend now to stay in their home locations and not move as they did in the past, part of that might be explained by occupational licensing regulations, housing restrictions. I'm sure a good deal of it is. But part of it also might be explained by the fact that locational preferences are a normal good. We just like to stay in familiar surroundings. The richer we are, the less desperate we are when we lose jobs to move elsewhere. And so, how much of the immobility, greater immobility of people when jobs are destroyed compared to in the past, how much of that greater that lowered mobility, geographic mobility, is due to regulatory restrictions, and how much is it just due to the fact that we're richer and people are consuming um, locational goods than in the past? Anyway, I trust that I have been sufficiently provocative, and I greatly appreciate your attention and the opportunity to talk to you. So I'm happy to take questions and threats and bribes.
Can
Thank you,
I ask?
Donald. This was
Oh,
great. Let's open it up for questions. David, do you have a question?
yeah. First of all, great talk as always. I always enjoy your talks. I told my wife this morning I'm going to see one of my favorite speakers.
Thank you,
I
David.
wanted to propose something, and it doesn't answer your big questions at the end. But you know where you showed the real wages falling after about 73?
Yeah, from 73 to about 90.
Yeah. Well, and I can't explain that, but I think I can explain some of 73 to about 76.
Mhm.
And I don't see anyone writing about this. We all know that when you have price controls, the real during price controls, real wages look higher than they really are. And so when you get rid of them and the CPI shoots up, that means that it doesn't mean real prices have increased. It means they've increased somewhat, but they've really made up for the phony prices we had. And I would bet, I don't know, but I would bet that if you look at the relaxation of price controls over 70, really 72 to 75, that could explain maybe 3 or 4 points of that, which is a substantial number.
And I like that point, and I'll ask Michael Strain if that point occurred to him. I don't recall that he adjusted for it in his book, but weren't there still some price controls in place as recently as late as 1979?
Well, yeah, one.
No, but an important one.
Gasoline. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's right. That's right. And it was relaxed in stages. And by the way, just a fun thing, your 63 Buick Skylark, I can never hear about that without hearing Marisa Tomei's voice when she's playing on the
Oh yeah,
sound. It's a 64, but anyway, anyway, thank you. That was great.
yeah, yeah.
What do you make of the geopolitical argument for trade policy? So assume you're trading with a hostile power.
Hmm.
And should you use trade policy to deal with that threat, assuming you believe it is actually a hostile power?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And I should have been explicit at the beginning of my talk that I was talking about purely the economic arguments for trade. I think there's some justification for that concentration because I believe if you look at the sympathy for trade, it's all economic. The vast majority of it's economic. I mean, people are worried about their jobs, they're worried about wages. But yes, obviously there is a legitimate national security concern, Adam Smith famously explicitly identified national security as an exception to his case for unilateral free trade. Uh, uh, so I agree that in principle, I'm putting my hand up and thinking, I agree that in principle, I can't deny that there is such an exception, and I'm open to hearing uh, uh, good reasons for accepting this particular product, that particular industry, as a case to be excluded from a case for free trade. But of course, that is so easy to abuse. The moment you open up the national security argument, then everything becomes national security. Um, I had the good fortune. One of my teachers in graduate school was Leland Yeager, a great international trade scholar. And I remember Leland Yeager saying that he remembered in the 1960s, clothespin manufacturers went to Congress arguing for protection for clothespins because clothespins were national security, essential for national security. And he said this, and it was obviously silly. Um, but one other point, I see Anthony Gregory has his hand up, and he may be on this point too. But one other point here is that uh, uh, it's well, two other points. Number one, when you protect an industry, even when that's legitimately deserving of protection for national security reasons, the very protection winds up over time perhaps undermining national security because protection makes an industry less competitive, less entrepreneurial, less innovative. So its costs are going to be higher over time than otherwise because they're subject to less competition. Their rate of innovating to produce new products, that's going to be lower over time. So that is a cost of national security protection that should be kept in mind. And so it should temper our enthusiasm for using protectionism on national security grounds. And a second point to make is the due commerce thesis. And that is, and there is some data I think pretty powerful data that show that the more economically integrated societies are, the less likely they are to get into hot shooting wars with each other. It doesn't mean that this thesis does not say, of course, the moment you start trading, all risk of war completely disappears. That's ridiculous. But the chances do fall away. And the more integrated the economies become, the further those chances of war decline. And so when we impose trade restrictions, we are making ourselves less integrated uh, with countries that we very well might go to war with. And perhaps greater integration might be the means of reducing the prospects of war rather than lesser integration generated by the national security protection. These are all um, uh, uh, very practical, on the ground, specific, detailed, pragmatic decisions that have to be made on a case-by-case basis.
Anthony.
Thanks for the great thanks for the great presentation. I have a question about how many of the economic nationalists who stress, say, the trade deficit, do you think are actually primarily motivated by economics and in particular the trade deficit? Deaths of despair and these other kind of national security aside, there seems to be a lot of cultural, social impetus behind this, and I think one of the stark examples of why is a few months ago, or maybe it's just a month ago. It's hard to keep track. When there was a lot of talk about excluding foreign college students, either Chinese students in general or some small number of students. I saw in a lot of the discourse a defense of a really broad ban on foreign college students who, as I understand it, are on balance subsidizing higher education for locals because a lot of the foreign students, international students who come in pay high tuition.
Pay the full, yeah.
They pay the full tuition. which, as I understand, I'm not an economist, that would actually count as services that would reduce America's trade deficit, right? So the more,
When when foreigners come to the United States to get educated, that's
yes,
considered to be an American export of services. Yes.
right. And it would, and if you really cared about the trade deficit, or if that was a primary concern, um, then even if you had other reasons for not wanting people to come in and buy services or pay tuition, you'd have to acknowledge, well, we're willing to have an even larger trade deficit to kick these students out. Is that right?
Yep.
So I guess what I'm asking is, have you noticed economic nationalists actually motivated largely by economics or primarily by economics, where some of them would say, well, maybe we need more students, international students. Maybe
Yeah.
we need more international visitors to come buy services. Do you even see that acknowledged as a factor? Because if it's not acknowledged as a factor by people who say, well, maybe we should restrict the students for other reasons, cultural reasons. We don't want to be intertwined. We don't want to be dependent on Chinese, whatever it is. But do you see, I think you get what, do you see that acknowledged as a countervailing factor when they're really focused on the trade deficit?
Not really. I am sure that, in some remote academic place, this point has been made. But I haven't seen it in the public discourse. I doubt it's ever come out of the White House or on Fox News. Um, the the economic, if you take what is said, take people at the word at their word, given what they say, then the economic ignorance of the current administration on trade is just off the charts. I mean, it's just astonishingly bad. Um, and so I don't know if they even make this connection. Uh, uh, the uh, they believe. I just happened to read a few days ago, very carefully for the first time, the April 2nd uh, uh, Liberation Tariffs Day executive order that President Trump famously or infamously, depending on your view, imposed. And he had to declare an emergency in order to get the executive authority to impose those tariffs. And the emergency that he declared wasn't just that America has had a 50-year run of trade deficits with the whole world. It is instead that America has goods trade deficits. So he explicitly in that document excludes services, which is a nutty thing to do. The United States, 80% of the US economy is services now. To be technical, 79%. So basically, $4 in every $5 that America's produced is services. It would be bizarre if an economy that is so service oriented did not have a goods trade deficit. I mean, the whole concept of goods trade deficit is silly to begin with, but it would be crazy if we imported, exported more goods than we import, given how service oriented we all are. But it gets even worse. That executive order wasn't just that we have a goods trade deficit with the rest of the world. It's that we have a goods trade deficit with each of the individual countries that we trade. Right. It's complete. It's not just nonsense on stilts. It's nonsense on a gigantic space-bound superfuel rocket. It's just nuts to think that concept means anything. So you point out, Anthony, a correct, analytically correct point, but I frankly doubt it would have any purchase among people in the White House these days. But your point is correct. I have my long-winded way of saying, yes, you're right. Yeah.
Okay.
So I remember from my undergrad courses on international trade, I'm very rusty on them, but I remember that one of the theoretical points the teachers would make about protectionism and more specifically about tariffs is that there would be a way for a country to exploit their, market power essentially against other countries. Do you have any sort of historical example where that really worked or not?
I'm sure this is the optimal tariff theory. It goes back to Robert Torrens in the early 19th century, and it's very technical. And the idea is that if your country, the home country, is such a large buyer of some imports, that country can basically, by exploiting its monopsony power over the market, can push the prices that it pays for those things down. And so we get those things by giving up fewer of our things.
Right.
Lots of people who, a shockingly large number of people who will say, "Oh, well, what must be going on in the White House is, they're using the optimum trade theory." They're not. I mean, they want fewer imports, and they want us to export more. And so that's inconsistent with the optimum trade. Now, this is not your question. You asked for historical examples. I'm sure some exist, and but I don't know the answer to that question offhand. There was a very famous passage in that Francis Edgeworth made in one of his works well over 100 years ago. Edgeworth was a very, very technical, non-ideological, highly theoretical economist, and he said about the theory of the optimum tariff, he said, really it's best if it's labeled, I don't remember the exact words, but if it's labeled poison and put in the back of the medicine chest. So it's technically a thing, but to imagine that it would serve as a practical guide to policy is just unrealistic.
Okay, thank you. John, Adam.
Hi, thanks for a very interesting talk. I just had one question and an example. You mentioned furniture as being something which has not suffered particularly from trade changes over the years. But
Well, it has to go down. Yeah.
hang on, I've lived in North Carolina for many years, and when I first came here, there was a huge furniture industry, which, as far as I can see, has totally disappeared in North Carolina. So that's one example. The second point is, what would you say to people who say that competition with a country like China is unfair because they treat their workers very badly, they force wages to be low and so on. So we're getting goods made under conditions that we would not tolerate. And the overall effect of the trade, obviously, is some benefit to China, but is there not some loss to us? Anyway, thank you again.
So on your first point, I think I perhaps misspoke or I wasn't clear enough when I mentioned the furniture part. Furniture production did rise a bit in the period covered by those data that I showed, but since the 1990s, it has fallen off a great deal. You're exactly right that the American furniture industry it's not completely gone in North Carolina. My son went to High Point University, but it's largely gone. It's not what it used to be. Now, on the China point, so this is an empirical question. To what extent is what we get from China, to what extent is it made with workers who are exploited in an economic sense of the term, where their wages don't keep pace with their productivity? I had a graduate student of mine. He graduated in 2019, I think. He's from China. He's now teaching in Louisiana, Li Peng. And one of the chapters in his dissertation was to see if, as best as he could, if the wages of Chinese manufacturing workers were keeping pace with the productivity of those workers. So, he speaks Chinese. He was back in China. He was looking for this stuff. Chinese data are not very reliable. That's a huge caveat. What Lee, my student, found, and I forget offhand exactly what dates he had. I think it was 1988 through 2015, maybe. I don't know. He found that by and large, the wages were keeping pace with the productivity growth. Now, again, the data from China, you have to take them with a grain of salt, maybe several. But if that's true, then that fact means that at least those manufacturing workers aren't being exploited. They're being paid the value of their marginal product. But let me be a little bit. Let me say a little bit more. As an economic matter, so if you take seriously, people say, "Well, America first. Who cares about foreigners? Just America first." Right? Now, I'm not one of those people. Right? I consider myself to be it's a cuss word these days, but a cosmopolitan, an international cosmopolitan. But if you take seriously America first, who cares about the others? Then we shouldn't care if the reason we're getting cheap goods from China is because the Chinese government somehow managing to arrange, or Chinese employers are somehow managing to exploit Chinese workers, and that's just a gift to us. We basically getting subsidized goods because of these poor workers abroad being worked mercilessly. Now, again, I'm not an American firster in that sense. And so now we come to an ethical question. To what extent, I mean, there's no doubt we do benefit economically from that, but to what extent do we then use our policy to sacrifice some of our own wealth in order to perhaps pressure the Chinese to treat their workers better? This is, again, it's a very, very specific question. What kind of impact will our trade restrictions have in that direction? It's not clear to me they're going to work. Maybe they will. And as with the national security threat, it's very easy for that argument to be abused. It's not uncommon for people I get these arguments all the time with people. So, well, China, it's all slave labor. And I mean, the Chinese do treat some workers very, very badly, for sure. But what evidence do you have that it's slave labor? And then they point to the low wages. I mean, China still is a low-wage country compared to the United States. And low wages themselves are not a sufficient piece of evidence to show that it's slavery. If the productivity is low, then wages are going to be low. And so it's very easy to demagogue that idea. Oh, we can't trade with those people because they're being unfair. And they're being unfair to their own people. See how magnanimous we Americans are. We believe we should restrict our trade and restrict our benefits in order to help those poor foreign workers. If anyone in the Trump administration said that, maybe now I'm about to be unfair. If anyone in the Trump administration would say such a thing, I wouldn't believe them. I do think that they are an America first. They don't really care about foreigners. They have a zero-sum view of the world, and to the extent that we Americans are profiting from trading with foreigners, well, that's great. I don't think that they would want to sacrifice one penny of American wealth in order to enrich foreign workers through in any way. So.
Thank you for that, but I have to say I'm just as reluctant as you are to introduce any kind of compassion into an economic argument. But I think the usual argument is not compassion, but the fact that the American furniture industry has been destroyed by these low-wage people in China or Mexico or wherever.
Well, but that argument itself is not sufficient. Suppose the American furniture industry or whatever industry was destroyed not by artificially low wages abroad, but by a genuine bit of innovation abroad that gave foreigners a comparative advantage. The home industry would be no less destroyed in that case. Um, and so the question boils down to if all you're concerned with is the wealth of Americans, then it doesn't matter what is the source of the low prices of the inputs. Uh, Only if you are concerned about things beyond the just the narrow material wealth of Americans is the reason for the low price. Do the reasons for the low prices become relevant? So,
Thank you for that.
Okay, I have a final question, perhaps. Do you think of industrial policy as equally counterproductive than trade restrictions? And what do you think is the historical record on this?
so industrial policy means different things to different people, of course, and I've seen people use industrial policy to mean basically, to mean, okay, well, we for national security reasons, we need to, make sure we have a steel industry. Um, uh, Perhaps that kind of industrial policy might be able to work. There's no doubt if you protect an industry with high enough tariffs or heavy enough subsidies, you can get that industry larger. But I think the more general case that people make for industrial policy is that uh, it is a good way to raise living standards generally. The market is blind. Oren Cass, who I think I probably don't have to tell you who he is, Oren Cass uh, is on record as saying that the market is a drunk donkey. It's like a drunk donkey. And so that's why he endorses industrial policy. And it's a very powerful metaphor. I mean, who wants to ride a drunk donkey? Um, and so in his view, that these market signals are wholly unreliable. And so we're gonna sober up the donkey. We're gonna saddle it up and put on it a knowledgeable jockey, and that jockey is going to lead the donkey to the right place. And obviously the jockey is going to be someone who takes Oren Cass's advice about where that donkey should head. I have a completely different view of the market than does Oren Cass. I don't think the market's perfect, but I don't see any reason to believe that the market signals that entrepreneurs and investors and consumers respond to on a regular basis uh, uh, are such that they can be confidently overridden by someone like Oren Cass or politicians who Oren Cass might advise in order to raise overall living standards. In my view, uh, market signals generally tell entrepreneurs where profit opportunities are highest, and profit opportunities generally mean those opportunities to use relatively low valued resources to create relatively high valued outputs. Uh, and it's never perfect, of course, and people make mistakes, but there's a self-correcting mechanism in the market. People are spending and investing their own money, unlike with industrial policy, when you're spending and investing other people's money. Um, I've asked several times, I'm not the only person who has asked, I've asked Oren Cass and other advocates of industrial policy as a means of raising overall living standards. I said, well, we economists have a pretty good theory for where the information comes from and how it's processed that directs and allocates resources from one place to somewhere else in a way that explains how those resource reallocations improve overall economic well-being. Uh, what's your theory of knowledge? What's your theory of where the industrial policy planners will get their information? And again, it's crickets. They have no answer. They say, oh, well, we just need more manufacturing jobs. Well, that's just not an answer. Now, why do we need more manufacturing jobs? What kind of manufacturing jobs do we need? Where will these manufacturing jobs be? Why? How do you know that if we have more manufacturing jobs, that's going to result in a greater amount of economic prosperity for Americans than if we have whatever amount of manufacturing jobs are generated on the competitive market? And so they have no theory. They have no story to tell about where they're going to get the information they need to carry out the detailed plans that they would have to carry out if their schemes are going to work.
But I mean, most economists would accept the idea that the government needs to subsidize basic research because there are, big externalities coming from it, and there's a debate about that today. But I wonder whether we can extend that argument to some other important industries where there are huge network externalities that would not be developed by the market, maybe because, again, it's hard to monetize the investments, or it takes too much time to do it. And in those cases, maybe some people could make the case that there is room for government because there is a market failure. Do you buy that? Or
Alfred Marshall, economist a long time, Alfred Marshall, John Stuart Mill, in one form or another, accepted or recognized the theoretical legitimacy of these kinds of arguments. And I think as a matter of theory, it can't be denied. But why would I'll give two answers. One a little bit more, my second hopefully a little more sophisticated than my first, but I mean both of them seriously. Why would we? What reason do we have to trust politicians and bureaucrats to know where what industries have these externalities? Where's that information come from? You can describe the idea in a textbook or in a journal article, but in order to make it workable, you need to have someone who can distinguish in the real world. Yes, this is an industry that's destined to create positive externalities, and this is an industry that's not. And then you're going to have people who are not investing their own money, not putting their own resources at stake, making these decisions. And I don't see any reason to think that they're going to get it right. Now, you say, well, there's no reason to think the market's going to get it right, but at least people in the market are spending their own money. And if they make a mistake, they have a strong incentive to cut their losses as quickly as possible, unlike people who are making these political decisions. The second thing, I guess, is a little more historical. Alfred Marshall, who's writes this very very famous textbook in 1890, in Principles of Economics. It's really where we get supply and demand. Marshall is bent over backwards to be non-ideological, and he in the 1870s accepted the idea of infant industry protection as a legitimate exception to the case for free trade. And so he travels to the US. I think he came to the United States in 1875. And upon returning, he said, well, basically, I saw it in operation, and I no longer think it is a valid argument. I understand theoretically, it's indisputable. You can write the theory down very cleanly, but in practice, it doesn't work. And so, very much like the optimum tariff theory, the infant industry theory, I think, is one that should be marked as poison and put in the back of the medicine chest, and don't let the kiddies at it.
Okay, thank you very much.